Welcome to the Trouble with Oaks, New Jersey edition. This program is brought to you by the New Jersey Woodland Stewards Program. It was originally broadcast on University of Maryland Extension's website as a part of their Wildlife Wednesdays series. I am John Hooven, facilitator of the New Jersey Woodland Stewards Program, editor of the New Jersey Woodland Stewards Program online newsletter, and forest stewardship educator and Maryland Delaware Master Logger Program coordinator for University of Maryland Extension. I worked briefly for Maryland Forest Service as a project and county forester. I graduated recently from SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in December 2021 with a degree in Forest Ecosystem Science. My senior thesis at ESF focused on climate change and plant adaptations, specifically oaks, and the endorsement of prescribed fire in appropriate areas across New York State to assist oaks with propagating these areas in anticipation of a warmer climate. This particular presentation was taken from an article I was drafting on oak regeneration, inspired by a passage from Dr. Ralph Nyland's book, Silviculture: Concepts and Applications. Oaks are the richest species of tree genus in North America. The species richness increases headed southward to Mexico. The genus of oaks, Quercus, is in the order Fagaceae, along with beeches and chestnuts. These are all mast-producing species. In other words, the oaks and the nuts that the beeches and chestnuts create are known as mast. There are records of pollen that date back over 55 million years in Austria and 44 million years in North America. The genus of oaks is an old species. The types are grouped by physical characteristics that are genetically related. Red oaks are oaks that have leaves with bristles or spine-tip points. The leaf veins project beyond the tip of the leaves. Here we see the bristle tip at the end of the leaves and the vein that runs out to the end, forming the bristle tip. The leaves can be lobed, tubed, or entire. Entire means that they have a smooth edge that goes all the way around. Regardless of whether they are lobed, tubed, or entire, they still have a bristle tip at the end of the leaf. It's important to note the number of years it takes for acorns to mature in red oaks. Acorns are high in tannins and take 2 years to mature and germinate in the springtime. The fact that they are high in tannins makes the acorns bitter. The open-grained wood is pinkish or reddish in tint, thus the name red oak. Live oaks are a southern grouping of evergreen oaks that hold their leaves when other red and white oaks drop theirs. The live oaks are included in the red oak group because of the bristle tips at the end of their leaves. The leaves of live oaks are generally entire in margins. In contrast, the leaves of white oaks are lobed or wavy with rounded and smooth ends. You can see an absence of bristle tips on this example of a white oak, Quercus alba. Acorns have less tannins in white oaks, and they only take 1 year to mature. Also, as opposed to the red oaks, which germinate in the spring, the white oaks germinate in the fall. Seeing as how the acorns are less in tannins, they are sweeter. The wood has a very close-grained, plastic-like coated cell to them, and it makes it superb for barrel making, buckets, and ship hulls. The Basking Ridge oak was a white oak that lived for around 600 years in a cemetery at Basking Ridge, New Jersey. It died in 2016. Succeeding this was the Salem oak, another white oak growing in a cemetery in Salem, New Jersey. Unfortunately, it died in a storm in 2019. Oaks, the white oaks, have a tendency to be the longest lived of the oak species. Another section of oaks are known as cirrus. They're not native, but they would include the sawtooth oak, which this belongs to. Sawtooth oak are potentially invasive, but popular for wildlife. New Jersey has 19 native species of oaks and 1 naturalized species. The naturalized species is the sawtooth oak, which comes from Asia, but is very good to grow for wildlife. The list on the left shows the oaks that are in the red oak grouping. These include the northern red oak, the pin oak. The black oak, despite its name, is a red oak. Southern red oak and water oak are 2 of the oaks in the southern family that you can find in the southernmost regions of New Jersey. The willow oak is a bristle-tipped oak with an entire leaf margin. The shingle oak was actually utilized for making shingles by early colonists. The bare oak is a shrub species of oak that is very popular in the pine barrens. The white oaks on the right side include, of course, the white oak, Quercus alba, the post oak, which happens to be one of my favorites of the oaks, were utilized for making post. The bur oak and overcup oak are actually fringe oak species. There's not too many of them, but they do occur in New Jersey. Then we have the swamp white oak, which is more prevalent in the southern regions of the state. Chestnut oak, which, believe it or not, grows on rocky outcrops, Quercus montana, Montana meaning of the mountains. And as a result, this tree will be found on mountain ridges, but it's also quite popular in the New Jersey pine barrens. So with everything that we've seen and heard about the oak so far, we may be able to consider it the mighty oak, king of trees. But remember, thou art mortal. Because it's not easy being the king of trees. Only 1 in 10,000 acorns actually become a tree. That's a staggering statistic. Sprouts and saplings are subject to predation by deer and fungi. The mature trees become habitat for many species, but are also important to pathogenic fungi. Dead trees are excellent habitat for wildlife, including amphibians, snakes, birds, and saprotrophic fungi. Saprotrophs, as opposed to pathogens, are fungi that consume the deadwood inside a tree. Pathogenic fungi will actually kill the tree. Even rotting logs on the forest floor and dead leaves on the ground become habitat and a food source for wildlife. And when we say wildlife, we also mean insects. I just learned in Doug Ptolemy's book the nature of oaks that there are actually some caterpillar species which will consume dead leaves on the ground in the wintertime. Quite fascinating. Different insect larvae and isopods live in and around rotting logs on the ground and can be an important source of protein to some forest animals. While this example is of an oak from Great Britain, the ecological net is almost identical to that of oak trees in North America. We see, for example, that the oak will support winter moth caterpillars that feed the great tit, which feeds the sparrowhawk, which feeds the tawny owl. We also see the oak tree feeding bush crickets, which then become consumed by jays, again consumed by sparrowhawks, and etc. But we see, for example, the moss that lives on the ground underneath the tree that becomes suitable for the slug that then gets eaten by the hedgehog, which then gets eaten by the badger. So you can see there's a great circle of ecology here when it comes to the oak tree. The oak, of course, being at the center of the ecology. Important note about pollinators. Oaks themselves are wind pollinated, so they do not require pollinators to pollinate them. However, pollinators are very important to oak trees. When most folks think about pollinators, they immediately think of wildflowers. While pollinators are important to pollinating plants, pollinators have needs as larvae and feed on other plants in these early stages of life. Oaks support more pollinators in North America than any other tree genus. The next closest would be the black cherry in Prunus, willows in the Salix family, and the birches in Betula. Each of those supporting over 400 different species of pollinators. Understanding niche partitioning, species become dependent on specific species and are not necessarily generalist. We'll look forward to an example of the gypsy moth, which is more of a generalist. However, most species of pollinators are actually quite reliant on specific species that they live upon. There's always a big hype up with regard to planting wildflowers to support pollinators. But one of the things that is underappreciated is that we need to be planting trees to support pollinators. Wildflowers are needed, however, the trees are needed more. To contrast this, the closest wildflower genus supporting Lepidoptera, which are the butterflies and the moths, are Solidago, the goldenrods, at 115 species. Again, looking back at the oaks, we see that the oaks were supporting over 700 different species of pollinators. The next group of wildflowers in the genus Asters are at 112. And you can see, based on the list here, where we have the most amount of pollinators that are supported by wildflowers. So again, to bring home the point, we need to be planting trees to support our pollinators. Wildflowers, yes, they are needed as well, but the trees are needed also because the trees actually feed the pollinators. But it's not just about the animals and the insects, the pollinators that is. There are other insects as well that require oak trees to be in a part of their life. Here we take a look at the oak gall. Oak galls are caused by parasitic insects that inoculate various parts of the oak. The inoculation actually causes a swelling, creating a somewhat protective habitat for larvae and young insects to grow. And they actually feed inside the gall. The food is provided from the swelled gall, from the sugars the tree produces. Insects are host specific and not generalist. The shape and characteristic of the galls helps to identify. There are over 700 different species that call Quercus a host. Quercus, of course, being a genus of oaks. Mostly these insects are benign to their host. We see examples here. Let me get my pointer real quick for you. The Galty oak leaf, the Galty leaf gall on a white oak. This one over here is the wool sour gall on a red oak, probably a blackjack oak. And once again, another picture of the Galty leaf gall on white oaks. Oaks also support fungi. Some of these fungi feed invertebrates and provide habitat for organisms such as nematodes and springtails. Fungi that cause heart rot consume heartwood, causing the backbone that holds the tree up to be absent or weak, and subject to breakage in wind or storms. Saprophytic fungi that consume dead trees will consume not only dead standing trees or snags, but also dead wood, which is debris on the ground. Saprotrophs are a necessary decomposer that unlock the minerals stored in trees and release them back to the environment to be recycled. But they're not the only fungi. There are also fungi growing in and around roots of all trees in the ground that enable mineral nutrients to be used by the trees. These are mycorrhizae, and they have a symbiotic relationship with trees, increasing the water and nutrient flow to the tree in exchange for sugars that the tree produces during photosynthesis. Here we see a picture of the saprotroph chicken of the woods, a popular edible fungi that is distinctive in its appearance, making it very easy to identify. This fruiting body of the fungus Laetiparus sulphureus is associated with oaks and is a decomposer. It is important to note, however, if you're going to be looking for this edible fungi, you want to ensure it is coming from an oak and not a cherry tree or a conifer, as these are not edible. It's also important to note that you're looking for this fungi when it is fresh, because the longer it's around, it is not palatable. I want to make a note here about seeking mushrooms in the woods for consumption, that you should not do so on your own, that you should be using a professional or a mycologist when doing so. There are popular forages that are available. If you check with your local mycological society, they can direct you for more information. Remembering 1 in 10,000 acorns become a tree, the rest are victims of predation. Here we see the acorn weevil, right here. And if this is not the cutest bug you have ever seen, then there is no such thing. The acorn weevil is the genus Curculio in the order Coleoptera, which is the beetles. It uses this long snout right here to actually make a hole in the acorn to actually plant eggs that become larvae. The female beetles use mouthparts at the end of the long snout, called a rostrum, to make a hole when developing acorns on the tree. An egg is laid and a grub hatches, eating inside the acorn while it's still on the tree. The acorn then falls to the ground in the fall, and the grub bores a hole out of the acorn and descends into the soil, where it continues to live for 1 to 2 years before pupating and developing into an adult, at which time the whole cycle repeats itself and it goes through and does this all over again. Interesting to note that the beetles themselves can be consumed by spiders and weevil wasp. So once again, we have one acorn which is supporting a specific species, which then supports other species as well. A majority of acorns catched by animals during the season are often forgotten. These sprout from the ground and emerge as saplings. The red oaks, of course, being in the spring, and the white oaks in the fall. Over 100 species of vertebrate animals eat acorns. The general preference is for white over red, once again due to the bitterness. Interestingly enough, blue jays and other jays cache acorns along with squirrels. In effect, these are nature's tree planters. But the animals in the forest are not the only ones that rely on oaks. We as animals, we humans, also rely on the oaks. And we use the wood to make whiskey barrels, furniture, joinery, flooring, paneling, decking, veneers, medicinal purposes. Apparently, at one point in time, they were used to treat asthma, hemorrhoids, diarrhea, gastric ulcers, and wound healing. It's the most important hardwood species for lumber, and it's exceeded only by 3 other conifer species in overall importance. So we should be planting oaks, we should be tending them, and we should be taking care of them. There are remarkable demands for oak from an ecological perspective when you not only look at our needs, but also that of the animals and the pollinators and the other tree species itself. I thought this was interesting. I included this from the Maryland presentation. The board you see here, right here, this actually represents a board foot of lumber. And I'll read to you what it says on there. This board foot of lumber, which was red oak, was sawn from a tree growing within the Garrett State Forest. Thanks to scientific management, the State Forest of Maryland produced more than 77 of these board feet every minute of every year. That's a phenomenal number. Old Ironsides, the USS Constitution, the oldest ship in the U.S. Navy, is one of the oldest ships still afloat, and it is made of white oak. The U.S. Navy still maintains a forest of mature white oak in Indiana for repair purposes of this special ship. Now, taking a short look at the biology and the ecology of oaks, and now we'll dive a little bit into the trouble with oaks. Stressors of an important genus. Resource allocation in a tree is finite. If resources are allocated to reproduction, they cannot also be allocated for things such as growth and repair. If trees lose their leaves as a result of spongy moth, for example, the resources to relief after a defoliation event takes away from the tree's ability to grow taller, wider, and reduces sugars to be stored for future use. Remember that it's all in the leaves, that the leaves are photosynthetic and are autotrophs and are able to produce what is needed for the tree to grow and survive based upon the respiration of carbon dioxide, introduction of water and sunlight, and as a result, photosynthesis, and it's able to produce what it needs to survive. If you take away the leaves, unfortunately, then the tree will die. One of the things that we've seen with regard to the trouble with oaks is oak decline. Oak decline is something that has been documented among many Mid-Atlantic and Northeastern states. The exception being New Jersey for some reason, and I'm not clear why not, but the idea is that there are a group of leading scientists that have been looking into this area and trying to figure out why exactly it is that oaks are in decline. As I'm going to read this quote here from the National Park Service, a host of stressors including climate, meaning the weather, in addition to the weather that is, tree age, site conditions, and a history of disease interact to weaken trees over time, ultimately leading to sudden death when the tree's resources are exhausted. This death by 1,000 cuts makes prevention of oak decline difficult, as stressors can vary both over time and location. One of the more unpopular invasive species to have impacted oak trees and trees in general, of course, is the spongy moth, which was formerly known as the gypsy moth. The spongy moth has a voracious appetite, especially for red oaks, and has a tendency to eat the leaves and let them drop. Sometimes the trees are able to refoliate after a defoliation event from spongy moth. Unfortunately, as we were saying before, these resources wind up taking away resources from the tree that it would use to grow. It's in effect putting those resources back to re-leafing out when it should be preparing for the winter, when it should be looking into making acorns. So this becomes a problem. Again, this is one of a few species that are affecting oak trees. Invasive species, of course, are a major problem. We look at another potential problem. This particular problem hasn't been well documented, if at all, in New Jersey yet. However, in Pennsylvania and New York, it has been documented. This is oak wilt. Oak wilt was first discovered in the Midwest in the 1940s. It's a fungal infection produced by I love saying this kind of stuff, Ceratocystis phagoserium. It is vectored by insects, animals, and the wind. In particular, though, we look at nitidewey beetles, which are shown here. These are sap-feeding beetles. And what happens is they will actually sense a tree that is in distress. They smell the sap, and they come in and basically have themselves a party in the tree. This is why it's very important not to prune oak trees in the summertime, especially in the month of June, because this is when sap-feeding beetles are quite active. Now, it remains to be seen, an interesting thing I pointed out when working with New York DEC and Forest Health, if there's a possible issue with cyclical cicadas, like the Brood X cicadas, which we saw a couple of years ago, back in, I believe it was the summer of 2021, I'm sorry. What happens is these cicadas come in and they will basically cause damage to the end of the branches on oak trees. And in the process of doing so, they leave a possible vector for the beetles to actually come in and attack the tree. It remains to be seen. I don't know if there's any research that's been done on this to determine whether or not there's an increase in the occurrence of oak wilt as a result, but it's something that is a possibility. Another pathogen which affects oaks, this is mainly out in California, Phytophthora ramorum, which is produces what's known as sudden oak death. And just based upon the name, both of these diseases are actually quite fatal to oak trees. The oak wilt actually affects red oaks more so than white oaks. And unfortunately, the oak trees will actually graft their roots to each other underneath the ground. So it can not only spread, the fungus can not only spread by the beetles and other organisms, but also through the roots of the trees itself. So once they find a tree that's infected with oak wilt, what they have to do is not only get rid of the tree, but they usually will trench around the tree to sever its roots from other trees as well to protect the rest of the oaks in the area. And of course, we have the issue of climate change. Whether or not people want to consider the fact that it is a factor that is caused by human activity, which is really hard to say that that is not the case. You can definitely say that carbon dioxide gets trapped in the atmosphere, just like a puffy coat, when you put it on, traps in the heat. And that's basically the way that climate is affected by carbon dioxide. So an excess of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, of course, is causing the climate to warm a lot faster than it normally would if it was anything but an anthropogenic climate event. Genetic variation and change only occurs over generations. So in the case of oak trees, it may take 20 or 30 years for a tree to start producing acorns. The generational life cycle is long. Evolution through genetic exchange for oaks is also long. The reliance is on the genetic variation of offspring produced in acorns, of course, the majority of which are consumed, as we already discovered. The trees cannot quickly adapt as fast as the climate is now changing. This is a serious problem, so it winds up being an issue for the oaks more so than most other species. And while we're talking about change, we also have to look at changes in management, which have affected the number of oaks in the landscape as well. This includes the change in land use, changes in forest management, and changes in wildlife. As a society, we've become disconnected from nature. The majority of people do not go out into the yards or woods that they have that surround their houses today. There is a passive approach to land management. We expect to let nature do its thing. It can be argued that nature has adapted to the disturbance of man since the dawn of natural resource extraction and farming. But we historically do not manage our natural areas the way we did 50 or even 100 years ago. Farms have gotten larger, smaller farms would have occasionally went fallow or were abandoned and could readily revert back to old fields and succeed to forest. Our land use, however, has changed dramatically. As land is developed today, it is almost always developed in ways that make it ecologically dead. Buildings are built to exceed the length of a human life, and impervious surface makes it impossible for anything to live in the soils. Further, stormwater runoff changes dramatically. We landscape areas for aesthetic values without generally considering the needs of wildlife. The management for landscaping takes very little consideration for the natural environment. Land use change is the #1 reason for forest deforestation in the temperate environment today. Certainly, oaks and pollinators suffer as a result. Historically, native and colonial land managers managed differently than we do today. One of the changes has been approach to fire. Native Americans actively managed the land with fire to promote good hunting grounds, berry production, and inhibit catastrophic wildfires. Natives also cleared the land for the sake of creating farms. Within the last century, many farms in the eastern U.S. were abandoned and these farmlands filled in with oak forest. We suppressed fire, and as a result, forest pathogens such as fungi and bacterial causes proliferated in mature forest of these areas where fire has been suppressed. So as a result, these changes are actively impacting the number of oaks that we have in the landscape. While this has all occurred, we have also changed wildlife management practices. Hunting is on the decline, and white-tailed deer have exploded exponentially across the landscape. Deer are having a dramatic and negative impact on forests as a whole, and the regeneration of oaks in particular. Additionally, species not favored by deer, typically most if not all invasives, will proliferate in the presence of high deer populations. Invasives can also outcompete oaks as they try to regenerate. So let's take a look at regeneration of oaks. If the 1% of acorns get to propagate, actually do get a chance, they may not be a viable seed, or they could be affected by damping off, a fungus that affects many seedlings, or they could be predated after propagation. They can suffer from wind damage, from storm damage, from fires, from flood, or environmental stressors of any sort, including soil pH, fertility, drought, heat, frost, any one of a number of things that can affect them. So once again, even though they get to become a tree, they have to survive the sapling stage, the seedling stage, that is. We take a look at regeneration. Site issues, of course, become very important. Among those, though, we look at the acorns, and they propagate best on bare ground. Too much leaf litter can actually inhibit growth. Interestingly, oak leaves do not readily break down. It is believed that this contributes to their fire dependency. Since the leaves persist in the environment, it increases the risk for ground fires that would clear the litter, allowing acorns to root. So, as you can see, fire, of course, is important to oaks. Oaks are actually a fire-dependent species, along with the American chestnut as well, which is at some point in time we look to hope to reintroduce to the forest environments. As Doug Ptolemy once again points out in his book that I mentioned earlier, The Nature of Oaks. He points out that in the leaf litter alone, or should we actually call it leaf litter, because litter is something that we think of as discarded when it's actually an essential function of the forest. The leaf litter can actually support up to 1 million nematodes per square meter. And this is just nematodes. There are several other microhabitants of that environment that rely on the leaf litter that actually become the beginning of the food chain. So without them, we would basically fall into collapse. It's a very interesting concept. And of course, can't have a presentation like this without talking about those expletive deer. I had a professor in school that was very unfond of deer just because of the damage that they do to the forest. I personally am seeing it myself. This is actually a picture of my own backyard. And if I can grab my pointer real quick here for you, this whole area back here in the understory used to be full of all kinds of heaths and huckleberries and blueberry bushes. They are all gone. I've never been able to see that far back into my woods before, thanks to these little critters right here. As you can see, a 150-pound deer can eat up to 12 pounds of food per day. Deer will leave behind the species that they do not wish to eat. They're very finicky. However, they also are reducing their future food sources in this manner. As I said, look at the woods behind them. That is absent of understory growth. You know, when you think about it, 12 pounds of food per day, that is a lot of leaves, vegetation, and saplings. And it's true, there's no oak saplings in that forest, and that's predominantly an oak forest that you see in the background there. 75% of the diet can be acorns in late fall. Many landowners would like to create more favorable habitat for deer, but this in itself can also inadvertently create pressure on the natural landscape, reducing favorable species that are victim of deer browse. The small tree on the right, it's a black oak, Quercus volutina. The tree is about 10 feet tall, and up to half of it has been browsed. I'll grab my pointer here real quickly to illustrate this. You can see that this part of the tree actually has been stripped away of any vegetation by deer. This tree escaped being browsed as a seedling as it grew up in a slash pile. This is actually in my front yard, and the slash pile was left behind when the tree guys came to work on the electric lines. That is, they wanted to make sure that the trees weren't going to fall on the electric lines, so they cut some stuff down and in the process left the slash in my front yard. This slash was left until recently, and once again the tree was actually able to grow and survived being browsed by deer because of the slash pile. It's very important to recognize that. The seedlings all on the left are growing on their own. The area is not really managed, but the seedlings escape the pressure of predation. How? The top photo shows seedlings that are right outside my front door. So obviously the deer aren't going to be going in that area since I frequent the area. So the deer won't be loitering. The lower picture is much more intriguing. Here the deer should be browsing, but it illustrates how lazy or intolerant the deer can be. You may see evergreen leaves across the top of the picture. And let me get my little pointer here so you can see that right up here. These seedlings are growing under an eastern red cedar, Juniperus virginiana. The deer, once again, they don't want to get aggravated. They don't want to stick their head down there and be aggravated by the overhanging branches. So if you eliminate deer pressure on seedlings and saplings, this will help the oak regeneration. So how is it that we eliminate the deer pressure on seedlings and saplings? This can be done through hunting, through hazing or frightening, the use of deer-resistant plants, which of course can work in both directions. Yes, the deer will not eat the resistant plants. However, in effect, it could also produce an unfavorable ecological environment. Repellents, habit modification, also using netting, tubes, or similar protection. Now, this picture in the diagram here, these are actually tree tubes protecting a recent planting that I was responsible for coordinating down in Maryland. These trees will protect the trees until they're about 5 years old, and by that time they should not be browsed by the deer and will hopefully survive. Now, a note on hazing and frightening. The reason there's an asterisk there is because this type of behavior can and should be regulated by wildlife management agencies. So you're going to have to check with your state laws and regulations to make sure that this type of behavior is not illegal. Originally, when I sat in on the 2015 New Jersey Woodland Stewards Program, I had asked the question whether or not dogs could be used to keep deer away from a certain area. And I was told that that's illegal because it's known as wildlife harassment. So be mindful of that. This is something that may seem like a good idea, but then again, you don't want to stress animals out, the wildlife. That can have a negative impact on wildlife as well. And of course, in addition to tree tubes, there's other mitigation efforts that can be used. One thing to consider is that we not only have to look out for the pressure from deer, but when we plant tree seedlings, which seems to be a common theme these days, it's very important that we maintain the areas so that they do not get too weedy, because this will actually encourage mice and voles, which will actually eat on the roots of trees. That's important because that will also lead to tree mortality as well in the sapling and seedling stages. So fencing, of course, is important. We can see here on the right-hand side of the fence that vegetation is doing quite well on the other side of the fence. Brush piles, of course, are important. We see slash here from an area that was clear cut. And believe it or not, the slash that's piled up here, even though it's a bit excessive, there is a small amount of trees which are growing within that slash. This particular example, unfortunately, is showing the type of regeneration that's not favorable. What's basically coming back here, despite the fact that a whole bunch of oak trees were harvested, what's coming back is hollies, because the hollies were the only thing that were actually leaving a legacy in the soil when it was being reseeded. So when the area was harvested, only the hollies were left behind, and the hollies were the one thing that seemed to be coming back in mass in this particular area. So that's one thing that we have to be mindful of when we're doing harvest operations. This over here on the left is an example. I put this in here to discuss. It's actually a slash wall that Cornell University had used in the Arnott Forest that has been very effective. This wall is actually 12 feet high. It was a clear-cut harvest, and they took all the slash and they piled it around the perimeters of the forest to actually protect it. And they put in gates, and they've had some really positive regeneration. Interestingly enough, it has not affected other wildlife, only the deer. So, for example, bears and foxes have been able to climb up and over the slash pile and enter inside of it and hunt for different critters that would still be living inside the areas of the slash wall. The slash walls themselves actually provide wildlife habitat as well. Unfortunately, we can't use them in New Jersey because of the way the regulations and laws are written, because they are considered a fire hazard, which would contribute to wildfire risk. But they're good up in north where the fire risk isn't as high. And again, it's been a very successful campaign at the Arnott Forest with Cornell University. This concludes the presentation. I thank you very much for watching. Unfortunately, this was not a live presentation, but it's recorded for your benefit. But if you have any questions, you feel free to use my email address at the bottom of the screen, and you can send me your questions, and I'll be more than happy to answer them. Additionally, I'd like to thank the University of Maryland Extension and the Wildlife Wednesday series for allowing me to reuse this presentation and customize it for use by the New Jersey Woodland Stewards Program. And here are my list of references. Speaking of references, I'd like to give a plug here to Mr. Talamy's book, The Nature of Oaks. I did come across this during my research and another presentation that was given on oak ecology by Forest Connect at Cornell University. I didn't really dive into using this book too much with regard to the reference and research on my presentation, as I had only just started reading it. But it is an excellent book, and I would highly recommend it. It's kind of a light read, so I would, if you enjoyed this presentation, I would suggest that you get a copy of this book and check it out. It's really worthwhile. So thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day, and make sure you hug a tree, especially an oak.